In, in section 2.2, you will solve absolute value equations and also absolute value inequalities. To begin with, reminding you the definition for absolute value. Those symbols for absolute value are those straight up and down bars. The definition for absolute value is distance from 0. So if I find the absolute value of 3, the distance from 0 to 3 is positive 3. If I am finding the absolute value of negative 3, so the distance from 0 to negative 3 is also 3. So remember, distance is always positive, so that's why absolute value symbols will change your number and make sure that it's always positive. We will find some extraneous solutions. That just means that when you solved it, it looked like it was an answer, and then when you went back to check it, it did not check out. These are our steps that we're going to use to solve these. Here is our first example. Your first step is that you want to isolate the absolute value symbol. So that means that we will get rid of the -9 and we will get rid of the 2. So I will add my 9 to the other side, which is what I did here to get 26. Then I will get rid of the 2 by dividing by 2. So I divided this side by 2, and then I'm dividing both terms over here by 2. Now that it is isolated, you're going to split it into two cases. So your first case, you will have 5x plus 1 equal to, and then the 2x plus 13. The other case is when you can have the absolute value of the negative. So you will do the negative of it, 5x plus 1 equals the negative 2x plus 13. So since the absolute value, again, has the same answer for two values on that number line, that's why you're splitting it into two cases. So then once you've split it, you just solve it. So I went ahead and minused my 2x, subtracted my 1, and divided by 3, and I got x to be 4. On this one over here, same thing. I distributed, added my 2x, minus my 1, and I got x to be negative 2. Now, these problems become long because you have to check all of your answers. So I have to go back and plug in my answer for my x value. So up here in my original equation is where I'm plugging it in at. So everywhere you had an x, you're going to put in a 4. So I put a 4 right here, and then I also put in a 4 on this side next to that x, or next to that 4. So once you have plugged it in, you just start solving using order of operations. So always put in everything for your absolute value first. So when I type that in, I got 21. Absolute value of 21 is just positive 21. So I'm doing 2 times 21 to get 42. And then I can subtract my 9 to get 33. So think of those absolute value symbols like parentheses, and you have to do those first. Then on the other side, you can just plug in the entire side and you got 33. So this side checks, so that's why this one would be an answer. So you would circle that guy. Then I would also come back and plug in negative 2 as well. So everywhere where there was an x, I plugged in negative 2. So I type in everything in the absolute value, so that gave me negative 9. The absolute value of a negative 9 is a positive 9. Okay, so then I'm doing order of operations. 2 times 9 minus 9, that's going to give me 9. And then on the right side, you can type that in your calculator and you get 9. So that one also checks. So that's why you would write down both of these guys as an answer. So x would equal 4 and negative 2 for your final answer. All right, pause the video and try the got it question. So in the got it question, you should be isolating the absolute value symbol. So that means you would want to get rid of that plus 2x first. So you should be minusing that 2x over. Now that there is nothing on the outside here, you can go ahead and split it into two cases. So I'm doing the positive version of what it was, and then I'm doing the negative version of what it was. Okay, now don't do the negative of both sides. You just want to do it of one side, and it doesn't matter which side you do the negative on, it will still work out the same. So on the left side over here, I moved my x, added my 3, and I got 1. On the right side, I distributed, moved my x out of my 3, and I got negative 1/5. Again, you have to go back and check your answers. So you have to go back to the original, and everywhere there's an x, you have to plug in those numbers. So I put in 1 for this x, that x, and this x over here. Okay, and then we start doing our order of operations. So treat these like parentheses, so the absolute value of 3. Absolute value of 3 is just positive 3. I times those and got 2, and so on the left side I got 5. Right side's pretty easy, I also got 5. So this guy is an answer. Then I plugged in my negative 1/5, typed this part into my calculator, got negative 4.2. Absolute value of that is a positive 4.2. And then when I subtracted 2/5, I got 3.8. When I typed in the right side, I also got 3.8. So both of these would be answers. So I would write x equals 1 and negative 1/5. Okay, so moving on here. So we just have more problems to kind of see what's going on, but the process is still the same. So you would isolate your absolute value. So I would move the x and the 2 over. That's what I was doing first. So I added my x divided by 2. Here is my absolute value equation. Now I'm going to split it into my two cases. So I have x plus 1 equals 2x minus 2, and then the x plus 1 equals the opposite of 2x minus 2. So then I solve it like I normally do. So I got x equal 3, and then I got x to equal 1/3. I'm going through that fairly quickly because you should know how to solve an equation by now. So now what you want to do is you want to check those. So when I put in 3 up in my original form, I had 2 times the absolute value of 4, which is just 2 times 4 minus 3, which is just giving me 5. And then when I did the other side, I also got 5. So I know that x equals 3 is one of my answers. Then when I plugged in my 1/3, I have the absolute value of 4/3. It came out as positive 4/3, times it by 2 and minus. When I did the right and the left side, it did not work out. So this guy is not one of my answers. So I would just write x equals 3 as my final answer. Pause the video and try the got it question. So in the got it question, you didn't have to move anything because it was already set up for you. All you had to do was split it. So after you solved it, you should have got negative 22/3 and negative 2/9. You will need the fraction forms because you cannot type in a repeating decimal, which both of those end up being, into your calculator. So you will need the fraction forms in order to check them. Okay, so I put this guy up in here. When I typed it all in, I got absolute value of negative 32, which is just a positive 32. When I put in the right side, though, I got a negative 32. So this guy over here ends up being an extraneous solution. So it is not one of my answers. Then when I put in the negative 2/9, I got positive 10.6 repeating on the left. And on the right, I got positive 10.6 repeating. So this would be my only answer that I would write down. All right, looking at a couple more examples here. So I would isolate my absolute value by minusing my 10 over. Then I would start to split it. But remember, your absolute value can only be equal to a positive answer, right? My absolute value can never be equal to a negative answer. So they'll try and trick you, and you'll get in the habit of going through the same process. You'll need to always check if this is just a number on the right side, make sure that it is positive. Because if it's not, you can't do it. I can't do the absolute value and get a negative 8 because distance is never negative. So this one is a no solution. Pause the video and try the next question. So in the next question, you would minus your 7x over, divide everybody by negative 2, and again, it's equal to just a negative 4 on the right side. Absolute value cannot be equal to a negative, so this is a no solution. Okay, so the next part is being able to write any absolute value equation based off a word problem. So the NFL regulates the inflation over air pressure of footballs used during games. It requires that footballs have an air pressure of 13 pounds per square inch, so that's PSI, plus or minus 0.5 PSI. What's the greatest and least acceptable air pressure of a regulation NFL football? If it didn't say write and solve an equation, you obviously could just take this 13, add 0.5 and minus 0.5 and find the least and the greatest. But since it says to solve, this is where you do your absolute value. So x minus your starting amount, so x minus 13 is equal to that. Plus or minus is always what it's going to be equal to. So I'm going to go up 0.5 and down 0.5. So then you can set it up and solve it if you want to, but if they ask you to write an equation, this is kind of your format. Starting amount plus or minus amount. Pause the video and try the next got it question. So here would be your equation since they asked you to write one. So my starting amount is 52%. I'm going as an error of 4. So then my least and greatest amounts would be 48 and 56%. Okay, so that takes care of part 1 of section 2.2. So then in part 2 is where we start solving inequalities. And this is where it becomes a little bit more hectic because you have that inequality. But the steps are pretty much the same, okay? So I'm still going to isolate my absolute value. So I'm going to add my 5 over. And I'm still going to split it. When you split it, make sure that you're doing the negative not on the right side, but of the left side, because you're going to see what happens to your symbols when you do that. So on this left one, I would add my 8, divide by 4, and I'd get x less than 6. On the right side, you would distribute that negative, subtract your 8, and divide by -4. Remember, when you are dividing by negatives, you do have to flip your symbol around. So what ends up happening is, on a number line, I have to be greater than -2 and less than 6. Both of those would be open circles because there's no equal sign. And since they end up colliding, that means that they're showing you an interval between those two numbers. So you can write it in this notation, -2 less than x less than 6. Or you can write it like this where it has the word and in between it. But you would need that word and in order for it to be correct. Pause the video and try the got it question. So in the got it question, we want to isolate that absolute value. So we would add our 8, divide by 3. So this one gets a little messy with that 1/3 in there. Then at this point, I'm splitting it into my two cases. So normal, and then on this one, I'm doing the opposite of that left side. So on the left side, I solved it. I got x to be less than or equal to -6. You did have to flip it at some point, well, depending on what you were doing. This side I distributed, and then I started to solve it, and I got x to be greater than or equal to -9. So when I graphed it, -9 and -6, if I'm greater than -9 and less than -6, these two are colliding, which is making it an and statement. So I would write it in this notation where I have my minimum and my maximum values. Okay, so there's other cases that can happen. So here's another example where we still have to isolate our absolute value. So we have to minus our 5 over and then come back and times everybody by 2. Okay, so none of that has changed. Next steps are still the same. You're going to split it. So you want to do the positive and the negative of that left side. And then start solving it. So on this side, I got greater than or equal to 2.5. On the other side, I got less than or equal to -3.5. When you graph it now, so if I'm doing closed at 2.5 and going greater than, and I'm doing closed and going less than at -3.5, notice my arrows are not colliding. So this is going to be an example of an or statement where there's going to be a gap of numbers in between. So you will need to write that word or in between them to show that you have that gap in between those two. Pause the video and try the got it question. So isolate your absolute value, so minus your 10, and then split it into your two cases. Solve on the left, you should have gotten x to be greater than 18. Solve it on the right, you should have gotten x to be less than -6. Once you graph it, you should be able to see you have a gap. So less than -6, greater than 18, and then you have that or in between there because it's a gap. Okay, one more piece where you can come up with an absolute value inequality based off a word problem. So after commercials, a TV show that is produced for an hour-long time slot is typically 42 minutes in length, but may vary by as much as 2.5 minutes. Let X be the actual length of the TV show. So remember when we did absolute value equations, we did X, your starting amount, and then whatever the budget is that you're changing, plus or minus. Same thing here. Starting amount is 42, and then it can vary by 2.5. It's not going to vary more than that, so that's why I did less than or equal to. Okay? And then you still solve it the same way. So split it and then set it into your two cases, and then you can solve it out. So then I can get x greater than or equal to 39.5 and less than 45.5. A lot of information in here because there's two separate things. So you have to be able to solve absolute value equations and then also solve inequality.